Hi there, I'm Nicole, and thanks for joining us here at Tweed Salvos. We're about to continue on our series on the biblical book of Romans, and I just want to warn you before we start that this series is a lot like a Netflix series that drops weekly or a weekly drama that you watch on TV. Because while it started out in week 1 giving you a bit of an overview of where it's heading, kind of setting the scene, for the next 3 weeks particularly, each episode is a bit of a cliffhanger after cliffhanger as the writer Paul takes us through a series of problems that leads to the climactic point in every good story where a wonderful answer comes that can resolve all of the issues. So I guess what I'm trying to say is hang in there. Hang in there over the next few weeks because this is a very good news story. But to fully appreciate how good it is, we need to realise, well, how messed up it got. And so we pick up today in Romans chapter 1. Starting at verse 24, that starts by saying, therefore. Therefore. Therefore means as a result of what's just been said. So let's go back a few verses to remind ourselves of what was just said that John touched on the last time we were together. Starting from verse 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that humankind are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as their God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal humans and birds and animals and reptiles. So what Paul is saying here is that God's power and nature is clearly visible to all people in the world that we live in. And inherently, it's visible in every human being in our conscience. So we know, but we didn't know because we didn't want to know. That's what he's saying. So rather than worship God as creator, the one who's ordered the pattern for this world and for our lives, we turned our back on him and swapped him out. I guess you could say it's like the way throughout history monarchs have been booted from the throne. We booted God from the throne of this world. Every single one of us, in little ways and in big ways, have walked away from the way that God ordered things, Paul says. And he says we decided to make our own way of doing things. So we put ourselves on the throne to be worshipped, and we ordered things around our personal desires. And did whatever they suggested, whatever feels good, whatever makes you happy, you do you. And we ordered things around our human logic and our thinking. We also put other humans that we admired on the throne and ordered things around what they said and did. We put the created world on the throne and worshipped the sun and the ocean and the stars. And when they called, we dropped everything and bowed down. He says we worshipped animals and reptiles so that rather than doing things the way God ordered and humankind protects and stewards them as this magnificent gift from God, they became the centre of our world. So in other words, instead of worshipping God and following the pattern that he created for us and our world, we all exchanged him for an order of our own making. That's what Paul is saying. And therefore, there it comes. Therefore, it created a disorder, if you will, an order other than the way that God originally ordered things. This disorder, and that affected everything. Paul said it like this in Romans 1:24. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. He gave us over. He allowed us, that's what it means, he allowed us as humankind to exercise our free will and boot him off the throne and worship created things, even ourselves. And the rest of this passage in Romans 1 from verse 24 through to 32 spells out the way that this disorder affected everything as a result. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list that Paul gives, but just a few examples of the effects of this disordering. And it's important to remember that what I mean by that is an order other than the way that God originally ordered the world. So it's disordered. I guess you could say it's a bit like Newton Newton's law of physics, right? Every action has an opposite and equal reaction. I guess in some small way, these verses are Paul's way of showing us this. You know, he's showing us the results of this disordering. And I think it's helpful for us if we group them in some general categories so we don't get sidetracked. So the first area that Paul speaks about is people's sexuality, humankind's sexuality. And Paul says that God's original order of that was changed. Sexuality that was intended in Genesis 2:24 for one woman, one man in an exclusive, lifelong covenant under God where they loved each other in the same way that God loved them, it was disordered. So he says that humankind now did degrading things with each other's bodies. He says that in verse 24. In verse 26, he says that humankind now had shameful sexual lusts, which means lusts that are outside of God's original intention. So Paul's talking here about lusts such as pedophilia, such as pornography, adultery, such as promiscuity, polyamory, sadomasochism, lusts that are self-centered and selfish. Paul goes on to add that same sexes were now inflamed with lust for one another. So people's sexuality was affected when we disordered it to follow a way other than God's way. And God gave us over to that. He allowed us to do that and the consequences that came from it. Paul also talks about how the economy and society was affected, how when humanity chose to follow their own way of doing things, it opened the door for things like greed, evil, wickedness. And so now we see things like people being exploited. You know, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, people being treated as objects. Paul says it opened the door to envy, to murder, to strife. So instead of loving one another, which was God's intended order, people gossip and slander others and are insolent and arrogant and boastful. And interestingly, Paul highlights that it affects all ages because he specifies, you know, you see children that disobey their parents as even children put themselves on the throne, even as a really young child, you know, where they're told no and they do it anyway. We've seen that, right? See, we see all these things in play in our world still, don't we? And worse still, we see it, or at least some of them at play in us at times, because this pull towards ordering things our way is now very imprinted on our beings, on our very beings. Our operating system, I guess if you like, has been disordered. Our very beings are affected. So now, as it says in verse 28, since we did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, in other words, his operating system, he gave us over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. We're drawn to it. It's imprinted in us. Paul says in verse 30 that we invent ways of doing evil. We're faithless, heartless, senseless, and ruthless about this stuff. And by the way, he's not just pointing the finger at everyone else here. He actually talks later in chapter 7 about his own struggle with this. He says, I don't do what I want to do, but instead I do what I hate. Oh, we know that struggle, right? I know that struggle. We know God's order is to forgive, but we want to judge and punish. You know, we know God's order is to love unconditionally, but we want people to earn it. We know God's order is to share, but we want to be greedy because we feel that we deserve it. We earned it, and they didn't, you know. We know God's order is to be kind, but it's just so irritating. And so we know what God wants us to do, but often we do not do that. We know it because when we booted God off the throne along with his order for life, it disordered our very beings. And this is the effect that every part of our humanity, from our sexuality to our economy to our social interactions to our very being, is affected. It's been disordered. All have sinned, Paul says in Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. All of us. There's no judgment to be had here because there is not one person who hasn't been affected. And Paul wants the Christians in the church, and maybe you're a Christian that goes to church, so he wants people like us to know that. Everyone's been affected. And it manifests itself differently in different people. And friends, let me point out that we don't always get to choose the way that it affects us, which way it affects us. It's not always a choice. However, as Paul told us in the introduction to this whole book, he said, in the gospel, in the good news about Jesus' birth, death and resurrection, the gospel, a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last. So it's a gospel that we need every day as we're tempted to slip into self-righteousness and bump God off the throne. And it's a gospel that we need every day as Satan tempts us to feel condemned and hopeless and unacceptable to God. A gospel that reveals a righteousness by faith in Jesus alone from first to last. You see, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever has faith in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. See, the gospel is good news. So let me encourage you to encounter the gospel afresh right now for yourself. Let me pray with you. God, I thank you for the good news of Jesus, for this righteousness that is by faith alone. Oh, that gives me such hope because, I'm pulled, as my friends are. I'm affected by this draw to boot you off the throne, God, and to do things my way, to think I know it all, to think other people that I admire know it all, and to not put you in your rightful place and order my life after the pattern that you suggested was the best. So I thank you for this righteousness that can be mine and can be my friends by faith because of Jesus and the gift of Jesus. And I pray today that we will each realise that afresh, that in those moments where we're tempted to be self-righteous, that it will draw us back, and those moments where we're tempted to feel condemned, that it will pull us up because it is a hope for our souls. It is a hope for every one of us. And I pray that that hope might sink very deeply for my friends that join me here just now. Amen. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you again sometime.